next week we are discussing and reading Beowulf, which is a great medieval Anglo-Saxon poem. And yes, we're going to be talking about that for the next little while. Now, it's a big shift from last week, which was Augustine. We've shifted genres quite dramatically here and time periods, and it possibly feels a little bit jarring. But the sort of existential realism of Augustine shifts here into a semi-historical poetry in a language that is. It's funny. It's a language we read it in English as a translation, but as a language, it is foreign. I've put a video up of someone reading it in Anglo-Saxon, but it's actually not foreign. It's our English comes from a lot of the English language comes from Anglo-Saxon language. But it's something I know very little about. But it's fascinating and amazing to listen to when someone's reading it. I don't know. Have you heard anyone reading? Oh yeah. Reading it. It's like you could almost listen to it as something to lull you. Like there's a sort of rhythmic. There's a rhythm to it as well. It's very punctuated. It's the way that the author of Beowulf uses consonant sort of rhythms and line rhythms is quite it's quite striking when you listen to it read in the original language.
Like any poet, I don't know much about Anglo-Saxon either, or Old English, but he's clearly, like any poet, figured out how to explore the limits and potentialities of his particular language. I think it's really fun.
So this poem was written, no one's actually quite sure when it was written, but it seems to have been written between the 7th and the 10th century sometime. And it's written about it's written by someone somewhere in England, someone who's a Christian, someone who is not of the people that he's writing about or of the time that he's writing about. And this, I think, seems to have generated some confusion about the poem, because I think people seem to think, it's either a bad history, it's a badly written myth or epic, it's syncretistic, it has pagan and Christian elements and so on. And so all of this seems really confusing at first, don't you think? Like if you first come across it, you think, what is this? What even is this? What is it about? Why are we reading about three episodes of someone fighting monsters? Like what are we meant to take away from this? I mean, it's enjoyable in and of itself anyway, I think. But there are some surface level elements which seem a little bit puzzling.
Can I just unpack the concept of syncretistic? Syncretism refers to taking a bit of this cultural world and a bit of that one, a bit of this philosophy and a bit of that one, and just sticking them together. And you can see why this might be read as a syncretistic tale. A couple of examples. The monster is said to be so we are inhabiting what looks, for the most part, like a purely pagan world. Driven by bloodshed, and the moral code is about vengeance and all of this sort of thing. There's no sense of a Christian afterlife or of a larger hope. There is a kind of people are liaising with dark powers and dark spiritual beings in a way that seems to be perfectly natural for them, just as violence and vengeance is perfectly natural. So we're immersed in this pagan world. Just for some examples, though, you may have other ones. The monster is said to be a descendant from Cain, the giant, I should say. I mean, there's different types of monsters. Grendel is a descendant of Cain, the first murderer in the book of Genesis, who was also marked out with it was cursed by God, driven out, never to live among men again, and marked by a visible curse so that people would always shun him. There's an example where we've got a monster which is straight out of the world of paganism, but as it were, stitched onto it is a biblical timeline to explain the existence of this monster. And there are other passages where Christian, where these pagan characters quote the Old Testament or allude to Old Testament passages, where the narrator inserts a bit of theological commentary.
There are passages where I think one of the most I think the Son of Cain theme is probably the most striking, explicit biblical framing of this monster. But the thing that keeps coming up is that occasionally the characters will seemingly refer to the Christian God in a way that seems very Christian, and that's befuddling as well.
Yeah. So they are pagans with some kind of vague monotheism, let's say, and even a Christian demonology, that these Satan is these monstrous beings are linked to Satan at times.
Yes.
So you can see how it could look like a syncretistic story. Bit of the Bible, bit of paganism, a fairly cavalier, unprincipled way of meshing them together.
That's definitely how it feels.
Maybe the poet isn't much of a Christian, but is kind of doing lip service to Christianity, but actually really is filled with nostalgia for the old days of pagan, of the pre-Christian European life. I don't think that's the right way to approach it. You don't either. Why don't you?
No, I read it as a like a Christian commentary on pagan culture. I see it as a retrospective assessment of what. So the author is Anglo-Saxon, and the Nordic people are sort of descendants of the Anglo-Saxons, so that they are in some sense ancestors. So he's looking back at his ancestry in some sense, at his ancestral culture, at his ancient ancestral culture, and I think there is probably something of nostalgia in there. I suspect. I think that if you read it, there's something very deeply human and noble about some of the characters, particularly Beowulf. Beowulf is not really criticised. In fact, in some ways, he seems to be. Interestingly, I think at the end of the poem, it's ambiguous as to whether he's even classified as a pagan in eternity, if that makes sense. So if you were going to sort of say, oh, where does he end up? If he's a pagan, does he end up in hell? It's actually ambiguous. So that's an interesting dynamic. So I think there is some sort of there's a positive. There's a mixed assessment of the Nordic, the Norse ancestry, and the Norse inheritance of the Anglo-Saxons, because there is also this. I think you've already alluded to it. I mean, there seems to be this hopelessness as well. There's seemingly no purpose to all this violence. There seems to be nothing at the end of it except for more violence. If you look at the end of the poem, where Beowulf defeats the dragon, the thing that they are concerned about before this happens and after this happens is that there is likely to be a flare-up of feuds and wars with these other people who are around them, the Swedes, and I can't remember the other group now. There's two groups they're particularly concerned about. And so that's sort of looming over this whole scenario anyway. So even though the dragon's defeated, there's all these other people who are likely going to come and have a battle or a war with them. So I would say there's sort of a mix between a sort of a positive sentiment and negative sentiment when looking back at this civilization or this time.
There are points too where so the poem ends and you feel, as you're saying, you feel that there is an impending disaster coming. And there are points where it alludes to the past. In some of the long digressive passages, there's a passage where someone sings this long song about past ancestors, and basically what it seems to boil down to is the same cycles of plundering, and violence, and then suffering retribution, and then paying them off by marrying someone off, or this whole futile, you could almost say petty cycle. The consequences aren't petty. There's constant bloodshed and unrest, but the actual motivations are like, you've got gold. Yeah. I'm going to come in and raid you and take your gold. Oh crap! Now I've got the gold. Someone's going to raid me. Like, it's quite a uncivilized. I don't know how else to say it. These are not big noble forces that are shaping the world. They are mean, narrow sort of motivations. Yeah. But so at the end, you feel that there's an impending doom coming, because we're still midway around the cycle at the point at which Beowulf dies. But earlier on, there's this long poem, and there are other passages that refer backwards to the past, where you realize, and the cycle that we're in has been perpetuating itself for generations. We are all steeped in blood, and our ancestors were steeped in blood, and that there is something profoundly futile and pointless about that whole cycle. So that even the great victories, and Beowulf is, like you say, he's a noble character. He is portrayed very favorably. His motives seem to be pure. He's not after power. He's not after wealth. He is. He's a good king. He's a good king. Yeah. He's doing things in a spirit of genuine service and self-sacrifice and everything else. And yet even his victories, when you take the larger view, you think, well, they're victories as part of this cycle. They're high points on a cycle which is futile, self-defeating, and somehow deeply, there's an ominous quality. There's a quality of defeat, despair. Yeah, I don't know. There's something despairing about it. Yeah. So the thing that I think is, from what I understand, the thing that's most Beowulf has been a puzzle to critics. There was a critical tradition of Beowulf which looked at it quite negatively as this unrefined, syncretistic hodgepodge of allusions to other Nordic myths, to other Norse mythology. But then there's these three monsters which are kind of gaudy and a bit cheesy, and the structure seems like there's no depth. There seems to be very little depth to the characters. There's this critical tradition which doesn't really quite know what to make of it. It seems to me, and so they criticize it on very modern terms. Like they say, it's foregrounding things which aren't very interesting and backgrounding things which are very interesting. So people want to know more about some of the background stories that are brought up in the song, for example, or they want to know more about the feuds that are happening between the different tribes. And so people say, well, why are we focusing on these three battles, and why would you fight these monsters anyway? It's a little bit sort of, I don't know, like it seems a little bit gaudy, I guess. And so people haven't. It seems like there's been a line of criticism which says, yeah, it's interesting as a kind of as a historical artifact, but as a piece of literature, it's very unrefined. And so I think if you take some of the elements that you're referring to there, some of the syncretism and so on, and you leave it and you go, well, what does this even really offer us? It seems fairly shallow and lacking in real meaning. Especially when you consider that the author was obviously at least some kind of a Christian. But then there's this really brilliant essay by J.R.R. Tolkien, author of The Lord of the Rings and of The Hobbit, who actually sort of turned that whole interpretive tradition on its head and reread it in a way that seems to properly realise the significance of the poem, the purpose of the poem, the structure of the poem, and so on, because that was another thing that critics would criticise it on, was it lacked structure. And Tolkien is a major figure in the reception of this poem. He was a great Old English scholar, a great scholar of Beowulf, and in his own fictional works, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, if you've read Beowulf, you can see how many elements Tolkien and the subsequent fantasy tradition have picked up.
Let me give you one, because I've actually
sure.
just started reading The Hobbit with my two older children.
Me too. We've been reading. Oh yeah, as well.
Okay, cool. And so in the great Beowulfian kind of motif in The Hobbit is the dragon in the cave sitting on the pile of gold. And that's what Bilbo is going to sort out, and that's exactly what Beowulf sorts out as well. So I mean, that's a good, just a classic example of that. The
presence of it is. It's a figure. The figure of the dragon on his gold is straight from Beowulf. Some of the use of magical objects and other things as well in Tolkien are very Beowulfian. Even just the presence of gold. If you think of the importance of, if you think of gold as one of the themes of this tale of Beowulf, you get that in The Hobbit at least. I don't think so much in The Lord of the Rings. The extraordinary things that people will do. The dwarfs have this in their blood, a kind of lust for gold, which is pre-rational. It's not always in their own interest. They're not doing anything with it once they get it. They just love sitting down, and they're like the dragon in a way. They want to be down in their minds with the gold.
Yes.
That's gold is a kind of moral problem almost, I think, in Beowulf as well, or it's at least part of that cycle of futility. There's a finite amount of this stuff. We all want it. We don't it's not particularly serving our interest in any obvious way. But we are determined to get it, and there's all kinds of complications that are going to ensue because we need it. I think I want to hear about the Tolkien essay, but just one more comment on the gold. I think in Lord of the Rings, where treasure no longer plays a key role, Tolkien still kind of condenses the gold theme down into the Ring of Power, and you see Gollum and Frodo and others with this intense lust and longing to possess that object. It's a powerful object now. It's not just a shiny one like treasure, but he's still he's still intrigued by the concept of something about the human heart that responds to gold.
Yes.
In ways that are not good for us, in ways that don't serve any of our interests. Anyway, tell me about his essay, because I read that years ago and I haven't read it recently.
I read it just the other day in preparation for this, and there's a tremendous piece of writing. It was delivered as an address initially, so it reads quite easily because it's actually originally spoken. Tolkien takes a lot of the existing criticism, lines it up and says, well, here's where it falls short, and aren't we being a little bit too hard on this guy who's written this poem? He actually shows how there is actually a sensible structure. It's divided in two. There's the first part where Beowulf comes to the Danish lands and fights Grendel and Grendel's mother, and then there's the second part, which is where Beowulf is old, and he fights the dragon. He's the king at this point. He fights the dragon, and Tolkien, I think, rightly describes this as a kind of a rising and a setting. If you imagine a sun going up and down, he said this is framing like a hero's life, and it's showing how this hero comes to fame and then finishes his life. And so that's how the structure of the poem works. So he demonstrates that quite clearly. He also has a really helpful way, I think, of showing how the Christian and pagan elements are working together. So what he suggests is that the author was clearly an Anglo-Saxon Christian and was looking back and recalling and in some ways rewriting an older story, but for a Christian world to read back into and look at. And so there's a sort of, as we've alluded to, there's almost like a sadness or a sorrow in recalling the past, looking at the pagan heroes and the darkness of the pagan world and saying, it was futile, but it was also, it's this reflection on the futility of violence, and particularly of violence in a pagan world. But it's also it also recalls just the nobility of the human spirit, regardless of whether you're pagan or Christian. It has that theme all the way through it. So Tolkien is able to draw that out. He also shows how in the framing of the enemy as monstrous and as unhuman, the Christian Anglo-Saxon author is putting to the periphery human battles. The whole time there's these allusions to other battles that are occurring for these tribes, but the ones that Beowulf is dealing with are inhuman enemies. And so Tolkien wonders whether this Christian author is trying to communicate that the real enemy is not actually the one that we often think that we should fight. It's this darker force, this spiritual force. And in this case, it's depicted as Grendel's mother and the dragon.
Would that be a distinctively Christian idea, or is that a pagan idea?
It could be. Well? It could be both, because Tolkien talks about this quite a lot in the essay is called "The Monsters and the Critics."
Great title too.
It's a very good title. No, not distinctly Christian, because in Norse mythology there are interactions between the gods and the humans, and human figures are doing their thing, the gods are doing their own thing, and then they do come into contact. So there is a sense in which darker forces are at play, even if you're a Nordic man or a Nordic king, you're thinking about how there are supernatural forces and they're interacting with our world. But I think it's what could be seen as distinctly Christian is this foregrounding of spiritual battle over and against the sort of temporal battles.
So having the temporal battles there, but pushing them into the background. Yeah, that's very interesting.
So I think that Tolkien, it's insightful. Whether it's exactly right, maybe is another question. I feel like it could be right that is actually a Christian insight. At least in this case, it's something that a Christian is emphasizing for the fact, because he's a Christian. I think he's sort of re-understanding some of these dynamics in pagan culture.
And by the way, you can see the frustration of modern scholars whose interest is all in the stuff that's been pushed to the edges. Of course, monster stories are silly. We want to know exactly which clan was fighting which clan here.
That's exactly what the critics are
part of the agenda of the poem to refuse to treat those things as the center.
Yeah, exactly.
It's quite ironic.
Yeah, it is ironic. Exactly. They've actually misunderstood the mind of the author in that sense. Whereas I think Tolkien is able to draw that out. The true enemy isn't actually the Geats or the Swedes. The true enemy are the sons of Cain, the devil. It's sin. It's the darker spiritual forces. That's what it seems like the author is emphasizing in some ways. Beowulf is compared through hints in the songs and so on to other Norse heroes. So you have the reference to Sigmund, who is from the Volsungs and the Nibelungs epic, and heroes in Norse myth fight great dragons, and Sigmund is the great dragon slayer in Norse myth. And so there is this sort of parallel there, these comparisons made, but because Beowulf fights monsters, it places him in his struggles above these temporal struggles. He's fighting bigger struggles. It seems to Tolkien, and I think that's a pretty good read. So these are some things that Tolkien draws out. He does it in a much more articulate way than what I've done, but I've just summarised some of the things that I suppose he rationalises it and makes it make much more sense from a critical perspective. Whereas before you read it and the structure seems, this, for example, the structure just seemed like, yeah, exactly. If you're a modern secular critic, you're thinking, what? This is just like a kid's story. Why are we fighting monsters? Well,
why a third one?
Why another one?
Looking for something a bit linear
here. So Tolkien's able to cut through a lot of that and actually bring out some of the significances of those choices, the rational choices that this author has made. They're not it's not because he's a simpleton, or he's clearly not a simpleton. He's written a really amazing poem, and the language in it's quite something. But it's not a simpleton. He's not lacking in refinement or anything like that. that is actually focusing on themes that we need to re-understand in order to then understand the poem. There's a really interesting point, I think, made by Douglas Wilson as well, who I've linked this essay to on the website. That Wilson also adds another element in, I think, of interpretation, which is helpful, in that you have this whole story, this sort of bleak story of pagan infighting, and then there's not much infighting, is there? I mean, if anything, there's cooperation, but there is this sense of there's this sort of foreboding sense of war and chaos around all of this, and then you have these battles with these monsters. Beowulf dies, and Wilson argues that actually everyone who would have been reading Beowulf at the time that it was written would have been reading it and thinking, yeah, but we know who's coming next. Christ is coming next. He's the real hero who's going to come, because Beowulf's quite flawed. There's these Christ motifs, I guess, in his life, aren't there? Like, he descends into hell. He goes underground to fight Grendel's mother, and he fights the dragon underground. He gives his life for his people, so the dragon dies, he dies, and then his people are kind of free from the dragon, and so on and so forth.
Even the dragon itself, which of course is partly a pagan symbol, but in early Christian iconography, Christ is depicted fairly often defeating or slaying some kind of dragon-like monster. So even that is a. I got to show you, actually. This is this spoils the video because I have to stand up to get this.
That's fine.
Oh no, it's gone. It's in the other room. I have a wonderful example of this depicting Christ defeating this dragon with a fish hook.
Oh yes, I know the picture, actually.
Anyway, keep going.
No, that's fine.
And by the way, when he goes down into the underworld,
yes,
even the magical sword that he uses is inscribed with these biblical. Yeah. There are a lot of echoes of
heaps.
Christ. Yeah,
there's heaps, and so, but the thing is that he's not Christ. He doesn't actually bring an end to all these problems.
He doesn't break the vicious cycle.
No. And so Wilson argues, and I think quite cogently, that this is actually the poem's doing two more things on top of what Tolkien suggests. The first one is that it is sort of warning the potentially the new Christian the Anglo-Saxons who have just become Christians in relatively recent times. This is what life might be like if you go back. If you went back to not being a Christian, this is how it feels. This is the futility of pagan violence. The second thing that he's doing is he's showing that Wilson puts it like this: that Christ is just standing left of, like, just off stage, about to enter. And he's the unspoken the unspoken hero of the poem in that sense. So
there's potentially a kind of apologetic thrust to it.
Yeah.
If you think of and this is where the noble positive portrayal of Beowulf and not only Beowulf, it's not as if everything about this way of life is terrible. You know what I mean?
A lot of it's noble and admirable.
There is so much to admire. It is such a sympathetic, in many ways, a sort of robust, sympathetic portrayal of a way of life which for the readers would have been perhaps something they felt some nostalgia for. The old days. As Milton once said in one of his sonnets, when all our fathers worshipped stocks and stones. Even in the 17th century, Milton thinks of himself as the descendant of English pagans. So that sense that this is part of our own culture too. And the way the poem is both able to tap that nostalgia, to actually portray something that does make you look up to the pagans, not just down. Beowulf is a noble king and a great warrior and a self-sacrificing person, and there are values that are worth fighting for in this in this pagan world. To portray it sympathetically and almost to evoke the sense of nostalgia and yearning, while also showing that even the very best and greatest and noblest product of that culture, when you take the longer view, is still part of the problem, still part of the same unbroken cycle of bloodshed. Then you can see it as a kind of apologetic. And it's an interesting way of interpreting all those references to Christ, to the old, not references to Christ, but parallels to Christ, explicit references to the Old Testament, as if, or like the Old Testament itself, when you read it with Christian eyes, all of this by itself is cyclical. Think of the Old Testament cycle of God renewing the covenant, the people promising to be faithful, the people being faithless, and
going into exile,
going to exile. Reading the Old Testament without the New, you get the sense that this will just continue like this forever. Right. But reading it as a Christian, the cycle seems to be going on and on, but you know exactly what's next.
Right. Exactly. And that's where Christ is the unspoken hero, standing just off stage, waiting to enter and I suppose win the day.
Can I read a passage from the very?
Oh yeah, that'd be great.
From the very end, because I find the this translation by Seamus Heaney very
it's good.
Stirring, and we've referred. We've spoken a number of times about the sense of doom, the ominous ending, that the air of despair and futility. It's worth reading some of these words to really get a sense of it. If you look right at the end, so I'm on the last page of the poem. After his death,
there's the funeral pyre and all that.
Yeah, the funeral pyre. Maybe I'll read from there, from line 31, 37. They built a pyre for Beowulf, stacked and decked it until it stood foursquare, hung with helmets, heavy war shields, and shining armor, just as he had ordered.
Just before you go on, Heaney has tried to emulate the alliteration of the Anglo-Saxon.
Right.
You can see that hung with helmets, heavy war shields.
Right.
So that's a technique that he's using in the
translation. That's that oral quality you were talking about before.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, thanks. Then his warriors laid him in the middle of it, mourning a lord far famed and beloved. On a height they kindled the hugest of all funeral fires. Fumes of wood smoke billowed darkly up. The blaze roared and drowned out their weeping. Wind died down and flames wrought havoc in the hot bone house, burning it to the core. They were disconsolate and wailed aloud for their lord's decease. A gate woman too sang out in grief, with hair bound up. She unburdened herself of her worst fears, a wild litany of nightmare and lament. Her nation invaded, enemies on the rampage, bodies in piles, slavery and abasement. Heaven swallowed the smoke. I mean, that is, we're not exaggerating when we say it ends with a sense that this is all not just going nowhere, but going somewhere terrible.
Yep.
There is a terrible, almost palpable spiritual darkness that is pressing in as they burn the body of their king.
Yeah.
And it's those poems earlier that make you realize it's always been like this, but it is somehow intensifying now. It's all about to end. In a weird way, would you say there's even, although the Christian eschatology is missing, although Christ is missing from it, in a strange way, you do get the sense of a direction to history. You do get
like that. Yeah.
That to them, the perception is everything's about to come apart.
Yeah.
And perhaps the reader, the Christian Anglo-Saxon reader, has an ironic perspective on that.
Yeah.
Yes, it is all ending, and a new world is about to be born.
Right. That's a nice way of putting it. That this world is actually about to end. In fact, that last line, that last half of the line that you read, "Heaven swallowed the smoke," could be read in a different way, couldn't it?
Right. Yeah. Talk about that.
Is it as hopeless as it sounds? Heaven swallowed the smoke, perhaps because in the Bible, the smoke of incense are the prayers of the saints. It's the smoke rises, the prayer or smoke rises to the Lord. Is heaven swallowing the smoke here in some kind of? Is there something merciful, and something happening? I don't know, but that's an interest. I just think that's an interesting image there,
and a great example of using a biblical word.
Yeah.
Heaven is not a pagan word.
No.
You importing in a biblical word to describe this pagan scene of basically,
exactly.
It's not like a Christian funeral where you sing psalms and wait for the resurrection of the dead. This is this woman wailing out this litany of nightmare and despair. This is a very, very, very bleak depiction of the consolations that this way of life have to offer. And yet to use a biblical word, just to drop it in there as the way of describing it, is a very telling example of this. And you're right, there may be a hint there. Maybe. Certainly if Dante had known about Beowulf, he might have slotted him into that special place in hell. Not baptized, so he's not allowed in heaven, but he's definitely not being punished.
He must be
one of those unbaptized pagans whom even God admires. And sort of secretly wishes he could let into heaven, but it's against the rules.
Exactly.
Maybe Beowulf would be in that.
That's right. But I think it's it is a long, like, it's a big reading, but I think it's a really rewarding one, and a really powerful, interesting depiction of the pagan world. But it's also early Christian literature. So you've probably got these two elements happening here. It's not an epic. It's kind of almost not a myth. It sort of is and it sort of isn't. I mean, there's something semi-historical about it. But
with fairy tale like qualities mixed in with it.
So it's a curious beast in a lot of ways. But I think I certainly really enjoy it, and I hope everyone else is enjoying it too.
And a very relevant text as well, I think, for our generation, not only where fantasy literature is huge and so much of fantasy literature has roots in Beowulf, but even in film and television, the Beowulf-like motifs have become so pervasive, including that mix between history and spiritual forces and so on. So I think it's a really relevant one for understanding some of the cultural trends in our own time as well.
It shows how literature is actually, it's an expression of the human spirit. It's not just purely contextual. It's not just in time. It actually, all these themes transcend time as well. So thanks for the discussion.
Thanks, Simon.